Once upon a time, some months ago, I actually tackled a similar scenario to this one that also involved a young Bran Stark. In that video, I explored the premise of what might have happened if Bran had never caught Cersei and Jaime in the act in episode 1 of Thrones. In that storyline, he listened to his mom, Catelyn, never climbed the tower to see the queen and her brother doing the Dance of the Dragons, and so remained ignorant of their actions and remained without any serious injuries to his body. So he was never crippled and lost the use of his legs. Bran falling from the tower causes a lot of dominoes to fall in A Song of Ice and Fire. Assassination plots that pit the Starks and Lannisters against each other, enabling Littlefinger to inflame those tensions and push the realm towards war and chaos. Bran's journey to becoming the next three-eyed raven, and ultimately the next king of Westeros by the end of the show. Bran's fall sets a lot of things into motion. But what if it never happened? How could the story change if Bran Stark still climbed the tower, but managed to avoid detection by the queen and her brother, and somehow managed to escape without any kind of injuries? Let's find out. Our story opens on that fateful day at the end of episode 1 of Game of Thrones. Despite his mother's wishes and his own best efforts, which really weren't much in hindsight, Bran can't resist climbing up the side of the tower. He scales it carefully and quickly, as he's done many times before, only slowing once he reaches the window and begins to hear what's going on inside. The young boy lays eyes on the queen and her brother in the midst of the act. They don't see him watching though, not like canon. They're too caught up in each other to notice the young lordling as he stares at them in disbelief. He can hardly believe it. Bran heard all the old stories about the Targaryens, their incestuous customs, the lengths they went to keep the bloodlines pure as they held dominance over Westeros, from the time of Aegon the Conqueror to Aerys the Mad King. But as far as he knew, Cersei and Jaime were just Lannisters, and last time he checked, the queen was married, and a Kingsguard isn't supposed to sleep with anyone, much less a member of the royal family who also happens to be a part of his family as well. Bran stares for a few more moments in a panic before scrambling back down the side of the tower and running inside to the safety of his room. On the way though, Bran would bump into his father, Ned. He asks his son if there's anything wrong and where he's running off to so fast. Bran just says that he's tired and is going to sleep. He doesn't mention what he saw to his father and proceeds to go and lock himself in his room. The reason Bran doesn't say anything here to Ned is fairly simple in my opinion. Bran is still a child at this point, only about 10 years old, and he just saw a bunch of illegal things happening at once. The queen having an affair, a Kingsguard breaking his oath, acts of incest. It's a lot to process for a young mind. He's stressed out and doesn't really know what to say in response. I think a part of him would also be in denial about what he saw too. He'd be questioning himself, running the scenario back in his mind over and over again, and even when he does accept what he saw, depending on how far Bran decides to think into the future, there is also the added weight of wondering if he'd even be believed if he told anyone. He could tell his father, who may tell the king, but would King Robert really believe that Queen Cersei was sleeping with her brother? Like I said, Bran is only 10, and 10-year-olds have a wild imagination. At least, that's what most adults would think. Then, to further play into that childish mindset and the fear that comes with it, Bran thinks of his uncle, the one he was named for, Brandon. He heard the stories. Brandon had hurled accusations at the royal family when his Aunt Lyanna went missing, and he got strangled to death trying to save his father from being burned alive. What would happen to him if he did the same? With that thought on his mind, Bran decides to clam up for the time being. But as time passes and his father and sisters prepare to go to King's Landing with the king, some people begin to see he's anxious about something. They don't really pry about it though. They just assume that he's nervous about leaving home and going to the capital. Bran would be going with his father and siblings as they relocate to King's Landing. This was actually something that was supposed to happen for him in canon before he fell from the tower. Now with no injuries and a lack of paralysis, he's free to go with them. Before that though, he says goodbye to the other members of his family. His mother Catelyn, and his brothers, Robb, Rickon, and Jon. The two of them didn't really get to say a proper farewell in canon since Bran was in a coma, but now that he's wide awake, as they hit the road towards King's Landing in the Wall, he gives Jon a hug, tells him that he'll miss him, and Jon promises to send letters before he departs for the Wall. It's a heartwarming moment. Then Bran hits the road with his family. And eventually, their trip takes them to the Trident, where they stop to make camp for a while. While here, Arya decides to go down to the river and play with her friend Micah, the butcher's boy, like she did in canon. And this time with Bran around, she asks if her brother wants to come along with them too. He agrees and follows Arya. The three children begin play fighting with each other, with their direwolves, Summer and Nymeria sitting off in the shade observing. During the lighthearted moment, absent of all responsibilities, Arya begins to notice that something is off about Bran, and has been since they left Winterfell. As they play, she asks him what's wrong, and Bran initially doesn't want to say anything about it, but Arya continues to pry, and Bran eventually cracks. He starts to say that the other day, he saw the Queen, but he stops himself before he can finish. Prince Joffrey has suddenly appeared with Sansa. He inquires about what they're doing, and Arya tells him to go away like she did originally. Joffrey scoffs, not appreciating Arya's tone. He reminds her that he's a prince and he goes where he pleases, and begins to approach them. He looks past Arya and at Bran with his wooden stick. He asks if he wants to be a knight. Bran nods. Then Joffrey says that he'll need a better sparring partner than some loud girl. He offers himself as a replacement, and draws his sword, telling Bran to pick up his. Bran says it is just a stick, not a sword. Then Joffrey responds that real knights use swords, and since Bran doesn't have one, then he must not be a knight. He essentially punks Bran, and when Arya steps in telling Joffrey to leave him alone, he laughs and says that Bran needs a girl to fight his battles for him. Not that it would even be much of one if they were to fight anyway. So Joffrey puts his sword away, and instead of starting a fight with Bran, he walks off with Sansa, with no incident. In the show, he targeted Micah, the butcher's boy, who was also present here. During that confrontation, Micah accidentally hit Arya, and Joffrey uses as an excuse to target him, which then led to a fight breaking out between the prince and Arya, then the prince being bitten by a direwolf. With Bran and Arya present and the both of them being noble, I believe that they wouldn't be seen as ripe for abuse in the same way a commoner like Micah was when it comes to Joffrey. So for the time being, Joffrey is fine with just leaving things here, taunting Bran and then going on his way. Once the prince and their sister leaves, Arya asks Bran what he was going to say to her before they came along. But after coming face to face with Prince Joffrey like that, he says it was nothing, and leaves Arya and Micah by the river. After this point, the journey to King's Landing goes on without a hitch. Since there was no fight between the kids, Joffrey was never bitten. Lady was never killed because Nymeria escaped, and Cersei wanted a pound of flesh. Nymeria will stay with Arya as she goes to King's Landing since she was never forced to run, and Micah's life is spared since he wasn't accused of attacking the prince this time. The Lannisters and the Starks are on better terms as a result of this, with the only point of contention being between Joffrey, Arya, and Bran. So there's relative peace for the time being. Though the Stark family is still concerned about the contents of Lysa's letter that she sent earlier, that implicates the Lannisters in possibly murdering Jon Arryn. Ned and his children settle into King's Landing relatively well, and for the most part, not too much deviates from canon to start out with the exception of Bran being around now. He would feel like he's walking on eggshells while in King's Landing, surrounded by the Lannisters. In any other scenario, he'd be excited, but with the secret he holds inside, it's a terrifying experience. Bran would want to tell someone something, but the fear of repercussions holds him back for the time being. For now, he gets accustomed to life in the Red Keep. While in King's Landing, Bran has a desire to become a knight. This has been a long-time ambition of his since he was a child, and to accommodate him, he will be made a squire by his father. He'll be put under the tutelage of Barristan Selmy, who is widely regarded as a great knight, and a man trusted by the king and his father Ned. Most of his time at the Red Keep would be spent training with the old man, outside of playing with Arya, who would be very jealous that her brother gets to be trained unlike her. She wants to tag along with Bran, get her own lessons from Barristan, and this results in Ned employing Syrio Forel instead to assist Arya in her training. I even believe that at some point, Barristan and Syrio will combine their lessons together, letting the Stark children practice what they've learned separately against each other, for the sake of healthy competition and individual improvement. I also think that it would lead to some pretty fun banter between Barristan and Syrio, as they talk about their different fighting styles, what works in combat versus what doesn't, and their own experiences as well, as both seem very insightful on the topic of fighting. While training, I'm sure it would also be encouraged for Bran to spar with other people outside of his sister. there would definitely be instances where Bran is expected to train with Prince Joffrey. These sessions would definitely be an idea formulated by Robert, believing that it'll form some sense of camaraderie between the boys as they grow older. Those who train together stay together. It's a perfect bonding experience in the eyes of the king. These moments will be overseen by the boys' respective mentors, Barristan for Bran, and most likely, Jaime for Joffrey. In some ways, it's like the men having a bout through their students. I believe that most of the time, Bran would end up losing to Joffrey. Not necessarily because Joffrey is a better fighter than Bran, he doesn't seem that skilled if we're gonna be honest, but mainly because he's older than Bran, and has a physical advantage being bigger than him. Though there will be some times where Bran does get the upper hand on Joffrey and push him back some, which the prince does not like at all. And this just adds to that rivalry between the two boys, especially since Joffrey would taunt Bran every time he gets a win on him. And it's in moments like those, where he's beaten down and mocked, that Bran wants to blurt out the truth. Tell Joffrey what his mother and uncle really get up to when no one's looking, still ignorant to the fact that Jaime is really Joffrey's father. But the sight of the Kingslayer looming behind Joffrey after each match makes him back down. So Bran has a rough go of things, being bullied by the prince and stressed about the secret he carries. After one of these failed matches with Joffrey, Bran goes for a walk with his direwolf Summer, who has grown during the time he spent in King's Landing, in the palace gardens, in an attempt to clear his head. Here he'll encounter the younger Lannister siblings, Myrcella and Tommen, who will be much kinder to Bran than their older brother Joffrey would be. They'd ask if they could pet Summer, and Bran would let them. The three of them would get along pretty well. Myrcella would inquire about what it's like for Bran to train with her brother. Bran will hesitate, afraid of offending her by disrespecting Joffrey in front of her, but ultimately, in the heat of the moment, Bran will say something along the lines of, "Joffrey sucks." But Myrcella wouldn't be offended by that, since she doesn't seem to like Joffrey that much in either continuity, be it book or show. She'd agree with Bran and crap on her brother with him while he's not around. And for once, Bran seems to be having a pretty good time in King's Landing because of this. Having someone relate to him and sympathize shows that not everyone in the royal family is a jerk. And it possibly hints at something more developing between the princess and Bran as they bond over their mutual dislike of her brother. It's not too far-fetched, considering that Myrcella did have a crush on Robb in the books, and Catelyn fell in love with Ned after his older brother died, even though Ned was stated to not be as handsome as Brandon was when he was still alive. So I suppose anything is possible when it comes to these two children. But moving on. As Bran makes new friends in King's Landing, Ned will still be caught up in his investigation of Jon Arryn's murder. Finding the book of family lineages that he was reading before he died, locating the illegitimate children of King Robert, but Ned won't know what any of this means. For the most part, things would be peaceful in King's Landing, until King Robert formulates his plan to kill Daenerys after learning of her pregnancy. Ned will not go along with it, resigning his hand of the king to Robert like he did in canon, and resolving to leave the capital. But before he does, he decides to tie up some loose ends, once again doing more investigations on Jon Arryn before he goes on his way. During this time in canon, Jaime attacked Ned for the capture of his little brother Tyrion by his wife Catelyn, but that would not happen here. Since Bran was never pushed, there was never an assassination attempt on him. Catelyn never investigated it, and Tyrion was never framed for it by Littlefinger once Catelyn arrives in King's Landing, something that wouldn't even happen in this timeline since she never got the cat's paw dagger, and because of that, he won't be taken to the Vale to stand trial. He was allowed to make his way back south from the Wall unhindered, so Ned is allowed to conduct his business in peace. His men and Jory were never killed by Jaime's, and he never gets a spear through the leg. The conflict that would have ensued with the Lannisters later on is now non-existent. Tywin never assaults the Riverlands because of his son being taken, Jaime never rides off to join him in his fight, and Ned is allowed to make his plans to leave in peace. But it probably won't go the way he wants. Robert originally dismissed Ned in the heat of the moment, but after having some time to cool off, I believe he would have another talk with Ned to convince/force him to remain as his Hand of the King. It wouldn't be the first time that hands have tried to resign from their positions and kings have refused to accept the resignation. Aerys Targaryen once forced Tywin to remain as his Hand of the King after the Lion Lord tried to quit, and that would be the same here with Ned. They would heavily disagree on what happens with Daenerys, but with Ned being the only man Robert can trust, viewing him as a brother, he forces him to stay. disregarding his resignation and commanding him to remain as Hand of the King. Ned reluctantly agrees as the king is giving him an order, and things are still tense between the friends for the time being. In canon, Robert went on a hunt around this time, but this would not be something that happens here. The main reason Robert went on a hunt after giving Ned his position back was to clear his head, because of all the brewing drama between the Starks and the Lannisters. But with the two families on better terms, and not taking shots at each other every other day, Robert isn't as compelled to disappear into the woods for a while, which means that if he stays in King's Landing and inside the Red Keep, Cersei can't have Lancel get him drunk to the point that he can be killed by a boar. So because he doesn't go on a hunt, Robert remains king, and while he lives, this puts an end to the War of Five Kings before it can even start, since Robert's false son Joffrey and brothers Renly and Stannis won't be able to fight over his throne. And Barristan Selmy also remains on the Kingsguard for the time being, since he won't be dismissed by Joffrey, as he won't be the king. So he won't be going overseas to Daenerys for the foreseeable future, and he remains to train his squire Bran. It's also important to note that at this point in the story, after his fight with Jaime, Ned was planning to send his children back home to Winterfell, but that was mainly due to the growing tensions between the Lannisters and the Starks. But considering how much better things are for the families now, and the only point of contention between them being between Joffrey and Bran, which can just be chalked up to kids being kids, Ned has no real reason to send them back home, or try to at least. And this is important because when trying to send them away, Ned learns from Sansa the truth about Cersei and her children.
I don't want someone brave and gentle and strong, I want him! He'll be the greatest king that ever was, a golden lion, and I'll give him sons with beautiful blonde hair.
The lion's not a sigil, idiot.
It seems like such a minor thing, but if Ned never tries to send Sansa back home, she'll never throw a tantrum and give Ned a hint about Joffrey's true parentage. And it was the same way in the books, where Ned was absolutely clueless until Sansa threw a fit. And he even remarks about how it took a child to make him see the truth about the whole thing. So in this timeline, without Sansa throwing a tantrum, he's left clueless to what's really going on, with the only person with any kind of inkling as to what's really happening here being his son, Bran. But it'll be some time before he says anything. Though eventually, it will happen. The way I see things playing out is that Bran stumbles into his father's office one day and sees Ned is stressed out. He's still dealing with what's going on with Daenerys, while also trying to piece together what happened with Jon Arryn and the involvement of the Lannisters in his death. Nothing really stands out to him, and everything that Jon was looking into before he died just seems like nonsense to Ned. Bran wants to tell his dad how his training is going, and how Barristan has helped him get better during their time here. But in this moment where he's stressed out, Ned kind of dismisses Bran, telling him that they can talk later as he's working on something very important at the moment. Bran asks what he's working on, and he says that he's trying to figure out what happened with Jon Arryn before he died. Then he'd say Bran's Aunt Lysa seems to think the Lannisters are behind it. Normally, Ned wouldn't let something like this slip while his children are around, but in this moment, he forgets himself, as he's focused on something else and not thinking things all the way through. And this provides a moment for Bran to finally tell someone the truth. He hesitates at first, turning to leave, but before he does, he thinks on it for a moment, before turning back to his father, and he tells him that he saw them. The Queen and her brother together in one of the towers at Winterfell. This would be a shock to Ned, but he wouldn't be keen to believe Bran right away. He'd ask for more details. Bran would tell him how he went climbing against his mother's wishes, and he saw them. That's why he rushed off to bed so fast that day. He'd also say that he'd never said anything because he thought that no one would believe him. Kind of like Ned, who's struggling to. Ned would grapple with this information, unsure of what to believe at first, and tell Bran to go and not repeat this information to anyone else, or he may get in trouble. After he leaves, Ned stews on it a bit, and this is where the torch is lit for him. Why the book was so important to Jon Arryn before he died. He'll look through it and connect the dots, figuring out that if the children really were Robert's, then they would have his dark hair. But it's blonde, like their mother's, or like their father's. And Ned then thinks back to what his son said about seeing the Queen with Jaime, and that it all makes sense for him. This is the truth that Jon Arryn died for. At least, that's what he believes. To make sure of his claims though, Ned would seek out Bran in his room. He'd be talking with the Princess Marcella when his father arrived, because the two of them have become pretty good friends now. And Ned will ask for a moment alone with his son. The princess will oblige and leave. He'll then ask Bran, once the princess is gone, if he's absolutely certain about what he saw, and the boy will say yes. Bran will also ask if he's in trouble, but Ned will say no, but the queen and her brother will be after he tells the king. He won't be happy about it, and they will definitely be punished, but to ensure that happens, he's going to need Bran to recount his story to the king. Bran is nervous about that, telling King Robert what he saw at Winterfell, but he goes along with it for the sake of his father. Bran then wonders out loud if Princess Marcella and Prince Tommen will be okay once they find out the truth. He could care less about Joffrey, to be honest. And at this point, child that he is, Bran doesn't suspect that Cersei's children are Jaime's at this point. He's just thinking of the trauma they'll experience knowing the truth about their mother and uncle sleeping together. This causes Ned to reflect. If he goes to Robert with this, then this may mean consequences for the children as the spawn of infidelity and incest. He'll get flashbacks to how the Targaryen children were killed during the rebellion, and wouldn't want a repeat of that. So Ned would be torn on what to do. Like canon, he would want to give Cersei a heads up so she can run with her children, but he would need an opportunity, like Robert going on a hunt, to tell her that, so she can disappear in enough time. But on the flip side of that, if Robert isn't going on a hunt anytime soon, does he really feel like standing by while the queen commits treason continuously and her children are seen as heirs to the realm? While he just waits for the right time to tell Robert. Now of course, Ned could still give Cersei the heads up and do something like convince Robert to go out on a hunt with him, where after some time, Ned will eventually tell him the truth. This would give Cersei enough time to escape. But on the flip side of that, Ned has to consider the fact that maybe Cersei doesn't want to leave. Maybe she'll decide to take over the Red Keep while they're gone. If the Lannisters are capable of committing incest and adultery at the same time, who knows what they're capable of? I think at this point in the timeline, Ned would take a chance to tell Robert the truth and just hope that he can persuade him to spare the kids in the future, instead of just taking the chance of the Lannisters seeking their claws further into the realm, or Robert possibly dying on a hunt and leaving the succession out of balance. Then there would really be nothing that Ned could do. Accidents happen all the time after all, so Ned is going to take a chance to tell Robert the truth before things can take a dark turn. So when the time is right and Robert is alone, Ned goes to him and tells him his findings. Robert doesn't believe it at first, but after seeing how serious Ned is, then Ned having his son Bran come in and tell him in detail what he saw at Winterfell, and how none of the kids resemble him, Robert starts to give in. He immediately has Cersei, Jaime, and their children taken into custody, and has the Lannisters stand trial. News of this would reach Tywin, who would not take kindly to the king taking his children hostage. He would mobilize the Westerlands and begin marching towards King's Landing. In anticipation of this, though, Robert would have sent Renly back to Storm's Inn earlier to call the banners, so they could have forces capable of defending the crown in case of an attack. Though it will take some time for either force to arrive. Robert would hold a trial for Cersei and Jaime in the meantime, though he would really just want to kill them both on the spot. Ned would present his evidence, and Bran would recount his story. They would be accused of the murder of Jon Arryn, incest, infidelity, and oath-breaking. Cersei and Jaime would fight against this, saying it's a rigged trial because of course Bran is going to say whatever his father wants, and hair color doesn't mean anything when it comes to legitimacy. They'll even point out the fact that most of Ned's children look like Catelyn instead of him. It could easily be the same case with Cersei's children. But despite having some level of logic to their arguments, they all know that they won't be believed, and demand a trial by combat instead, since it's the only way that they're gonna walk out of here. Jaime would declare that he'll stand for them both against Robert's champion. Some of you may expect the Mountain to stand for Cersei and Jaime to stand for himself, but I don't think that's going to happen here. The Mountain is currently marching with Tywin, and Robert is not going to wait for Tywin and his army to show up to King's Landing, because at that point, they might as well just have an all-out war. And it's even clarified in the books that a member of the royal family, when accused of a crime, must have a Kingsguard to be their champion. And since Cersei is still technically a queen, this also applies to her. So Jaime is really the only viable option, unless she wants someone like Meryn Trant defending her, which wouldn't work out. Robert would then name the best knight he has on hand as his champion, Barristan Selmy. Robert would definitely want to fight the trial by combat himself, but he will be told by Ned that he is not in his prime anymore, and all he would do if he fought is guarantee that the Lannisters take the throne. So Jaime versus Barristan takes place, the young prodigy versus the old master, a fight of epic proportions. It would be an epic duel, with either side possibly coming out victorious. Truth be told, there is no real way to know who would win in a fight here. Jaime is so strong that in the books, after being chained and starved for almost a year in captivity, he still almost beats Brienne in a fight in the books. Brienne even says that it took everything she had to beat Jaime while he was weakened. And Barristan Selmy's prowess is spoken of throughout history. He killed a guy named Maelys Blackfyre when he was younger. A man so strong he could kill a horse with a single punch and twist a man's head right off his shoulders. And even in his old age, he is still one of the most feared men alive. It could honestly go either way. But I say that Barristan Selmy will beat Jaime after a very long-winded fight and sustaining a few injuries in the process. With the Kingslayer dead, Cersei is condemned and also most likely put to death too. As for the children, I believe Ned will convince Robert to give them to Tywin as some sort of peace offering. Joffrey, Tommen, and Marcella are innocent in this, and they didn't ask to be born, so they shouldn't have to die for their parents' mistakes. So he beseeches Robert to publicly declare them as bastards and send them home to their grandfather, along with Tyrion, who would have still been around here and made its way back to the capital at some point. He's also innocent of any crimes and has done nothing to the crown, so there's no need for him to die too. Robert would agree, albeit begrudgingly, and send them all on their way. Tywin wouldn't really be able to do much about it at this point, since even if he does want to take up the issue with the crown, it would be ill-advised. With the Stormlands supporting Robert, the North and the Riverlands supporting the crown through Ned, Stannis on Dragonstone, and potentially the Vale of Arryn, it seems like a doomed cause. So Tywin would have no choice but to go back to Casterly Rock after receiving his son and grandchildren on the way to King's Landing, unless he wants to start a war that he may lose. At this point, the only way he can retaliate is removing his financial support from the crown and leaving Robert to deal with all the debt he's amassed. In the meantime, Robert would have to pick up the pieces of his succession. He wouldn't be keen on marrying again after his wife cheated on him with her own brother. What I see happening is that Robert summons Stannis back to court, gives him a seat on the small council, and names him as heir to the Iron Throne for the time being. Meanwhile, Renly will begin scheming to get Margaery on the Iron Throne. In the books, Renly and the Tyrells were actually planning to make Margaery queen by having Robert set Cersei aside for her. With Cersei now dead, the same would happen here. She would be brought to court and pushed towards the king while he's emotionally vulnerable, so we may take a liking to her. But they would make sure that it's not as a simple mistress. They want a marriage pact and true-born children, heirs to the realm. Only time will tell if they get it, though. So, all in all, if Bran ever falls, the Lannisters are persecuted. The realm isn't plunged into a succession war, the Starks remain in power, the Tyrells make a bid for it, and for the foreseeable future, Bran never becomes the Three-Eyed Raven. This may mean that Hodor remains Willis, since it looks like Bran will be going back to the past and interacting with him. But that's all I have for today. I hope you all enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, tell me your thoughts down below, along with what changes you might have made to the story, and I will see you all next time.